There will be some sediment created, but the effects of that are limited by our adherence to strict dredge and environmental windows and the use of specialized equipment. And the environmental windows will serve to protect the waters and ensure that we don't dredge when there are fish who are present that would be harmed by the dredging program. And as I mentioned earlier, in order to offset and mitigate, as we would be required to do anyway, we have offered millions of dollars in mitigation. These points cover some of the more egregious misstatements and misrepresentations you've heard these past few weeks. Among others I could also cover are the claims that real estate values will drop, that airports close when LNG tankers sail by, that bike paths on Mount Hope Bridge will create as many jobs as a $700 million LNG terminal, that harbor seals will be threatened, that we are violating federal law, that there are active geological faults in the bay we haven't accounted for, that most of the U.S. terminals are in the Houston Ship Channel, that the Coast Guard won't provide security, but that Blackwater will. All those statements are false. And I encourage you to request of each of the witnesses who made those claims that they provide you with the documentation that backs up those claims. I suspect you may be waiting a long time to receive it. Mr. Chairman, as you yourself observed, the only other bay in the U.S. with the same types of values approaching those of Narragansett Bay is the Chesapeake Bay. I'm not going to debate the relative merits of the bays, but I will observe that for 4 decades there has been an operating LNG terminal in the Chesapeake Bay with an offshore berth and cryogenic unloading lines buried in a tunnel under the bay. For those 4 decades, the recreational values and life in the Chesapeake have continued with little or no problems. There is no reason to think the same would not be true also in Narragansett Bay. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to note that we have been joined in the audience by Representative Peter Martin. I think I saw him come in. And I have not a question from the audience, but a request from the audience that the poster be removed, as lovely a picture of Boston Harbor as it is, so that the audience can see you. I am now going to open the hearing up to questioning from members. Let me begin with, to my left, actually, I don't think I've acknowledged your arrival, Senator Felag. That was Senator Walter Felag from great communities of Warren, Bristol, and Tiverton. Thank you, Senator Felag.
I guess the first question would be in regard to the denial of the water quality certification by DEM. You're stating that you really don't need that particular approval. And I guess the question would be that we have an environmental agency that stated that the project is in violation of that water quality certification. So I guess the question would be is that how would you address this type of violation, and what are the proper construction and operations altering do you see in this project?
Well, I'm not specifically familiar with the denial. I'm not a lawyer, and I haven't seen the denial, but I'm happy to go back and see if we can find what the denial identified. I mean, there's the threshold question as to whether we even require the water quality certification for the state of Rhode Island. We required water quality certificate. I think it's we required a CRMC assent, and that the CRMC, as you know, failed to act on. And the federal courts, both the district and appeals court, ruled against the CRMC's delay in that matter.
Well, let me state it a different way then. In other words, what sort of compliance monitoring that you're going to use to ensure that the level of turbidity in your models? In other words, there's going to be some dredging, there's going to be some turbidity. What sort of checks are you going to have in place, or what sort of unbiased results are you going to garner from an independent agency to monitor that water quality?
Well, we have to follow I described the process by which we had to test the sediments for toxicity. Those same agencies, especially the Army Corps, have very specific operational requirements when we actually go to do dredging. They specify the types of dredge buckets you use, the scows you use to transport the dredge material, what they call scow overflow, which is what you do with the water that might spill out of the top of the scow from the wet dredge material. We use what are called environmental buckets. Those are buckets that actually close up and seal themselves around the dredge material, and that minimizes that. We're required to monitor the sediment that can flow around the dredging program. This is no different than the dredging process that occurred in the Providence River. And as you probably are aware, most of those sediments were actually fairly nasty and had to be buried in place. They weren't suitable because of the toxicity and the hazardous material. So, and that's all subject to ongoing environmental monitoring and review. And if the agency finds us in violation, they're going to shut us down until we correct the problem.
Well, one of the issues that we have in this particular case is that I believe that maybe 90% of the dredging is going to be in the state of Massachusetts,
Right.
and 10% in the state of Rhode Island. And how is that water quality going to be monitored by the state of Rhode Island and by the state of Massachusetts? In other words, basically what I'm looking for is what sort of water quality review are going to be in place for this particular project?
That's part of the discussions ongoing with Massachusetts, because as you say, 90% of the water quality is monitored. The dredging is in Massachusetts, and we are working with the state to establish what are the parameters of monitoring program. And they will enforce that. So clearly, if they're going to enforce tight monitoring restrictions around us in Massachusetts, that's going to prevent any sediment reaching Rhode Island.
Well, I guess part of the issue is that the dredge material is not going to be taken from Massachusetts and deposited into Massachusetts. My understanding, it's going to be transported through Rhode Island.
Yes.
So there's going to have to be a Rhode Island review to ensure that those particular disposals don't fall into our waters so without authorization.
That's a requirement the Army Corps will place on us in terms of how we fill the barges that transport the dredge materials. They're not allowed to spill on the way.
Thank you, Senator Felag. Senator Bates?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go back to the early part of your testimony where you talked about the price of natural gas and it'll be affected. You've got terminals in Everett, Gloucester, Boston Harbor, and I guess also in St. John, New Brunswick, which are all feeding Massachusetts. Is that correct?
They feed New
By the way,
England
is the
and
Gloucester,
Canada.
is the Gloucester terminal used much? The offshore?
They've claimed they're using it at near capacity this winter.
Okay. You
It's
show,
been moving at about 250 million cubic feet per day, natural gas, which is, when you look at what I call, when you look at the way pipelines operate there, that's pretty close to as much as they can flow.
all right, but you mentioned that the price of natural gas would come down with the Fall River terminal, even with those 4 terminals feeding Massachusetts, the supply?
Yes. If you look at the other figure, and I think we have it there, you'll see that we in New England still pay a premium relative to the rest of the country for natural gas.
Yeah,
When you see that,
I have it here.
right, when you see that, that means that your infrastructure is inadequate to meet peak demand.
Well, I'm still confused. I guess we haven't had a shortage of natural gas in Massachusetts or Rhode Island.
We don't have a shortage. No, what you do is we solve the issue of supply and demand by the market. And if you look back a year ago, you will see that prices when we had very cold weather were dramatically higher. And in fact, in 2004, Boston had the distinction of recording the highest natural gas prices in the world, $75 per million BTU, or about 10 times the price that was prevailing in Louisiana at that time.
Well, let me ask you one other question then. From these charts, almost every one of them shows Rhode Island and Massachusetts in the top 5
Yes.
in expense. What can you tell us and the taxpayers and citizens in Massachusetts and Rhode Island will happen to those rates? Will we be 10th, 15th?
No, I try to do some, and I mentioned in there, if you just assume that all we did was save 10% of the difference in price between Louisiana, which is the cheapest, and New England, which is the most expensive, that's worth $125 million a year in reduced energy pricing.
But where would that put us on the chart?
It wouldn't pull you all the way down, because
I understand that,
but it would drop us 10%, maybe 5% maybe. And I think you'll see, I think New England, the ISO, the grid operator came out just yesterday, the day before, with a press release noting that that electric prices have fallen dramatically last year because of lower natural gas prices nationwide.